let's move on over. Speaking of competitive, we're going to go to this next team that always defies our expectations, and it'll be interesting to see if they do it again this year. And it's going to be the Pittsburgh Steelers, as they also have gone through a lot of changes in terms. So dropped quarterback, or not dropped, but they got rid of quarterback Kenny Pickett. Also lost quarterback Mason Rudolph, who filled in a couple times for them, not just last season, but throughout the years. Wide receivers, Allen Robinson, and then Deontay Johnson as well. They sent him to Carolina. And on the offensive line, lost tackle Chukwuma Okorafor, who soaked up a lot of snaps for them, and then center Mason Cole as well. And then in the cornerback room on defense, lost Patrick Peterson, Chandon Sullivan, and Levi Wallace. And then in terms of additions, obviously the big ones here and the big question marks are quarterback Russell Wilson. They grabbed him off waivers because remember he was cut by the Broncos, and then obviously traded for quarterback Justin Fields from the Browns. And then also in the wide receiver room, grabbed Quez Watkins from the Eagles, wide receiver Cordarrelle Patterson. We'll see if they use him, multiple different ways. And then also wide receiver Van Jefferson they got in free agency. And then on defense, stole away Patrick Queen from the Ravens, division rival. And then also grabbed cornerbacks Dante Jackson from the Panthers. And then brought back Cameron Sutton from the Lions, I believe. And then safety also, they grabbed Deshaun Elliott. And then in the draft, finally address offensive line, especially with the first two picks, with first one being tackle Troy Fontenot out of Washington in the first round. And then also grabbed center Zach Frazier out of West Virginia in the second round. And it looks like Frazier may actually be their starter, since the guy who they were going to hope start, Nate Herbig, I believe is dealing with an injury. So are going to be slating that rookie in. And then also grabbed wide receiver Roman Wilson in the third out of Michigan. So we'll see if he will contribute to that room early. But John, what are your thoughts on the Steelers? Once again, like I said, they're always a little bit more scrappier, competitive than we all want them to be.
Yeah, and honestly, I think they're going to continue to be that this year. This might be the first offseason recently that I haven't absolutely obliterated the Steelers and thought that they were going to be terrible, and then they proved me wrong on the season, because it's felt like the wheels were going to fall off for years now, and it just doesn't happen over and over. And honestly, I kind of like the offseason they had. With Kenny Pickett, I wasn't a big fan. You remember like that draft class, like, even with him being the most NFL ready of the quarterbacks, I had him at my third spot just based off of the ceiling. I didn't think that his ceiling was going to be very high, and it ultimately wasn't. And I think we were both right in the fact that nobody in that class really felt like they were going to be great. And so you lose him. I'm fine with it. You know how I feel about Justin Fields. I still believe in the guy. I do think that there's a chance that if he's just put in the right situation, that he can thrive. And I do wonder if Pittsburgh is that right situation. The only problem is they added Russell Wilson, and apparently they've told him he's going to be the starter, and that was guaranteed when he signed. So, and I don't feel like Mike Tomlin's the kind of guy that would go back on his word, but I also feel like Mike Tomlin's the guy that would ultimately pick who he believes truly is the better player. So I don't know. It's a weird situation what's going to happen at quarterback. But regardless, I like the addition of Justin Fields, and I do think that Russell Wilson, although he gets a lot of criticism, and rightly so, I do think he's better than Kenny Pickett. So I think in general they've upgraded at quarterback. They lose longtime wide receiver Deontay Johnson. That does hurt. But if there's anything we know about the Steelers, it's that they're good at drafting receivers. So I'm interested to see what Calvin Austin can do this year, as he's maybe potentially going to come into his own. I'm interested to see how Roman Wilson can compete and maybe earn some snaps. And then obviously George Pickens, he had a great year. It feels like he had a very quiet, 1,000-yard season that not a lot of people are remembering. He got 1,100 yards last year. He had a great, solid season. So what can he do with a potential upgraded quarterback, especially a guy like Russell Wilson, who is at least known for being willing to throw it deep and having, one of the better deep balls in the NFL. George Pickens being a deep threat. Can they, build some early chemistry there? So I like the offseason they had in general. I like the offensive line focus they had. Troy Fontenot apparently is dealing with an injury, so he might be at risk of not potentially being able to start week one. But I like the addition of him and Zach Frazier, and I feel like Broderick Jones, who they drafted the year before in the first round at right tackle, just another year under his belt. he was a behemoth of a man. So, can he really help the offensive line get even better? Because, I mean, this is a team where, I mean, think back to like the David DeCastro days where their offensive line was like really freaking good. Villanueva at tackle, all those kind of guys. And the last 3 or 4 years, it's felt like the complete opposite. It's felt like the Steelers' offensive line has been absolutely pitiful. On paper, potentially arguably the worst in the league. Now, they've never actually been quite that bad, but they've still been bad. So I like the focus on the offensive line because I do think that if Fontenot and Zach Frazier can live up to the expectations, the draft capital invested in them, then this offensive line could maybe become a strength, considering we've got 2 first-round tackles now. You've got a second-round center. James Daniels is, solid guard. Samulu, a solid guard as well. So I'm interested to see how the offensive line performs. And then overall, I really like what they did on defense. You add Patrick Queen into the linebacker core, division rival there. They lose him, so you bring him in. And their defensive line's always been solid. You've obviously got TJ Watt, you've got Cameron Hayward, you've got Larry Ogunjobi, who's been solid for them. So I like that. Yeah, they added DeMarvin Leal in, a couple drafts ago. So can he continue to be even better? But I really like what they did in the secondary. Obviously, Joey Porter Jr. was a revelation for them last year. He was really good. You add Dante Jackson, who's a solid corner on the other side, and I think stylistically very different. Dante Jackson, really fast, quick. Joey Porter's got the size, so you can kind of match up depending on who the receiver you're playing is. And then you add Deshaun Elliott at safety, who I felt was actually really solid for the Ravens and deserved more playing time. They just had a problem where they had too many good safeties. So when you add a guy like Kyle Hamilton and Marcus Williams in the same offseason, that just doesn't leave Deshaun Elliott in a position where he was really able to do much. So I like the addition of him on the opposite side of Minkah Fitzpatrick. So I'm very excited actually to see how the Steelers secondary looks. And I don't know what their ceiling is, but this is probably the first season in which I'm not going to sit here and declare that the Steelers are going to be a bottom 5 team in the NFL. I think they'll actually continue to kind of be one of those middle of the pack teams that is challenging for the wild card spots.
Yeah, I think one of the rare times where I think the media has it right, though, is it's going to be interesting. I think it depends on how the quarterback situation goes and what they get out of those quarterbacks, too, because we all know that there's questions around both of them. With Russ, it's can he get back to what he once was, which I don't think he can, especially the magic that he was able to, the improvisation with his legs. But hopefully, obviously, like you mentioned, he still always have had one of the better deep balls, especially in regards to touch and such. So maybe if I think the system will provide a little more, will cater more to his style, like similar to Seattle, because they're very similar stylistically. Hey, we're going to play good defense. We're always going to run the ball. And then, on offense, it's going to be usually relatively simple, but obviously it leaves more room for interpretation for Russ, maybe to extend some plays. But it'll be interesting to see and this is preseason, and I know Russ was dealing with an injury early in camp in preseason, but it just seemed like, especially that first game where Justin Fields stepped in as well, Fields looked better in terms of making plays out of nothing, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that follows. That is always kind of been one of Justin's strength is his legs, and obviously he's still in the prime of his youth as well, so he still has that ability. It's just a matter of I guess just processing and delivering the ball consistently, which once again having a little more simplified offense, maybe that'll help him out as well and other such, because some may feel that Chicago didn't give him the best of opportunities, and he had also dealt with injuries throughout Chicago too, so it's tough to get the ball rolling and pick up where you left off or keep your momentum going in terms of performance, especially when Justin was a little bit more of a raw quarterback, not of a natural thrower, as some would say, even though he's still a solid thrower. So, but yeah, I mean, you mentioned the offensive lines. It's one of the first things he says, one of the first times where I'm like, okay, I'm not cringing when I'm seeing this offensive line. I'm not too worried if I'm whoever's behind quarterback that they could. We saw later in the year they got the run game going too last year with a combo of Najee Harris and Jalen Warren, and I'm assuming that's also why they brought Cordarrelle to add maybe a third little explosiveness in case one of those guys falters, and Jalen Warren's already kind of dealing with an injury, so maybe that's kudos to them for that. And then the defense, they always figure out a way as long as they have like you mentioned their core pieces, Watt, Cameron Hayward, Minkah, and added. And I'm with you. I like the addition of Patrick Queen to kind of stabilize that linebacker room, because they've kind of had guys come in and out in that linebacker room. Fortunately, I thought Devin Bush was going to be the guy. Obviously, he tore his ACL and it didn't work out there. They brought in a couple of guys throughout to kind of help stabilize that. So hopefully, the two, Patrick Queen and Atlanta Roberts, who's been pretty solid as a kind of a role guy throughout his career, they can be solid. And then of course Alex Highsmith he's actually been pretty solid for them at times as well. So yeah, it's an encouraging year for the Steelers. I'm not going to sit here and say, though, I think we can both agree that they would probably be in the conversation late in January, February. But yeah, they're definitely going to be a competitive team. And yeah, definitely, I would say definitely this year I'm more sure of it above 500. So it looks like Mike Tomlin's streak will continue. I would presume, because as opposed to the last 2 years, this year just feels a little bit more better talent wise for them across the board. So we'll see.
Real quick,
go ahead.
There is one thing that we didn't talk about that I do think we got to talk about with the Steelers, which is they fired Matt Canada.
Yes.
Steelers fans rejoice. They've hired Arthur Smith. How do you feel about the Arthur Smith offensive coordinator hire?
I like his... Okay, schematically, I like Arthur Smith because it fits Pittsburgh, where they're going to want to run the ball first, and they do creative things off the play action and set that up. And I know this is probably where you're going to. It's just always been a question, especially in Atlanta, of personnel usage. But I would assume, especially with what happened with Pickens, I don't even remember last year and such, there was times where he was unhappy with obviously publicly unhappy with his target share, and then they changed that as the season went on. It just feels like. And once again, I felt that way in Atlanta, but one would assume that he's going to learn from his mistakes, and he's not in charge in terms of hierarchy. Sure. So I would assume if he's doing the BS that he was doing last year, where he's, feeding the backup tight end or backup running back, or backup wide receiver, like Van Jefferson, Mike Tomlin's going to get in his ear and be like, hey, like, we got George Pickens, stop using him as a decoy. But Once again, that's projection. So I'm encouraged. But I know that there is definitely reason for skepticism. But Matt Canada's offensive Matt just wasn't, I think, as creative and in depth, and definitely didn't kind of match their identity. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I think it's a positive, but who knows? But what are your thoughts as one of the more public Arthur Smith?
Well, I mean, listen, my beef with Arthur Smith has always been related to fantasy football and the fact that which it extended into real life because of the way the Falcons were built as a roster, the inability to somehow find a way to use Kyle Pitts and Drake London. I don't think that's going to be as big of a deal with Pittsburgh, because I don't think that Pittsburgh has like these two clear, heavily invested first round, like top 10 picks on offense and not much else. That's what Atlanta kind of was. And it felt like we couldn't get them involved. It was blowing my mind. But I will say the one time that Kyle Pitts had a great season, and it was under Arthur Smith, was Arthur Smith's first ever year. And the one key thing there was that quarterback was Matt Ryan. And the one piece of credit I will always give Arthur Smith, or not credit, I guess piece of relief I will give credit in the relief in the Arthur Smith criticism, is that he had Marcus Mariota and then he had Desmond Ridder, who were bad. So once again, say what you will about Russell Wilson, he's better than Mariota and Desmond Ridder. So, and he's a veteran. So even if he's not going to be the Russell Wilson of old, at the very least, maybe Arthur Smith can accomplish more, like you said, when it comes to the play action and the different plays and the ways that he wants to creatively get people involved with a veteran quarterback like a Russell Wilson. So I'm willing to give him a chance, but if by week 6 George Pickens is complaining about his production, I'm back on the Arthur Smith hate train. That's all I'm going to say. Yeah. So we'll see how he does.
We'll see. And also one important thing too, like very similar style to Tennessee, because remember Tennessee, once again, it's kind of a little bit similar formula. Remember Tannehill, people were down to him. He was pretty solid. Obviously, they were able to get AJ Brown involved. I'm sure that's once again that's why it was odd, because in Tennessee you're able to get AJ Brown involved, and of course Derrick Henry, you made sure to feed him, and Tannehill was pretty solid throughout most of the regular season for them. And just like I said, for some reason, they work in Atlanta, whether it be quarterback situation. And maybe, obviously it's always different being the head coach too, because sometimes you have to address, things on the defense and special teams. You can't spend as much time with the offense as well. But so in theory, this feels like a redemption time opportunity for Arthur Smith, especially in terms of being an offensive mind and play caller, play designers. So that's definitely going to be huge for them. And we'll see, how that affects Pittsburgh. And I will say too, sorry, one last note. I know it's preseason and there's only like one game, but it was tough. And I was a Broderick Jones hyper, but he had a tough game against Greg Russo against the Bills. And his limited snaps once again limited. So, maybe it was just a tough week for Broderick, but hopefully he can. That was just an anomaly, and he can continue to live up to his potential. Like I said, he is a behemoth of a man, and if they get him and Fontenot healthy, they can be some staples at tackle, like you mentioned, kind of like how they used to have with that amazing O line with DeCastro, Pouncey, and Villanueva, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple of two other guys, but nonetheless, we'll see if Pittsburgh can keep defying the odds and keep Mike Tomlin's streak of being